let's do graphs of sine and cosine. So this is section 5.5 in your book. We're going to have a lot of fun here. This will probably take a few videos, might take a couple of videos to actually get all the way through, because I don't know, we'll see how long I have to talk for here. All right, so here's how I wanted to start. I made a table of values here. So x is going to be our variable because we're making graphs, right? So we're going to have x's and y's. So we're plugging in x into our trig functions. And I just wanted, you'll notice I have the compass points going around the circle, and we're doing this in radians. We always do this in radians. Don't do this in degrees unless it's specified. So, if you think about your unit circle, 0 is to the right, pi over 2 is straight up, pi is out to the left, 3 pi over 2 is at the bottom, and 2 pi is back to the right. And so I took the liberty of filling in all the values for sine and cosine for each of those angles. And hopefully, here's what you notice. There are exactly 3 numbers that come out: 0, 1, and -1. And the important thing to remember is that so go back and look at that unit circle again, okay? Keep in mind, these are all going to be 0s and 1s because we're on the 4 axes, or we're on the x and y axes. We're at those 4 compass points. So if you go through cosine at 0, you get 1. When you get to the top, you get 0, then -1, 0, and 1. And sine starts at 0 and goes 0, then up to 1, then 0, then down to -1, and to 0. And so here's what the graphs end up looking like. So you'll notice on the x-axis, I've labeled those values. I didn't label 0. I thought we could all figure that one out. But here's the thing. Sine and cosine, they just keep doing the same thing over and over again. They go up and down and up and down and up and down. That's it. They do it forever. They actually do it in both directions. I only graphed out to the right here. But they do it forever. And so the nice thing is, if you remember, that cosine graphs are all on the y-axis are always going to start at the top. You start at 1. And then you go right down the list. And we'll talk about how to get these values on the x-axis here in just a few minutes. But you just go right down the list. And wherever you have an x value, you put the next point. So I start at the top. Then I go to the middle for the next point. Then I go all the way to the bottom. And then I come back up to the middle and to the top. And if I wanted to keep this going, because we will actually be doing 2 full periods, this is just 1. But if I wanted to keep this going, I would just start over. I'm at the top, my next point would be in the middle, then at the bottom, and so forth. So, key point here, when you're making a cosine graph, it starts at the top, at +1. Okay? No big deal. For sine always starts at 0. If we go back to our table of values here, at 0, sine is 0. And it does the exact same pattern, it just starts in a different place. So whereas cosine starts at the top at 1, sine starts right in the middle at 0. So it goes from 0, and then it goes up to 1, back down to 0, down to -1, and back to 0. And so that's the first thing I really want you to kind of get in your head, that we're going to spend a lot of time, or we're going to spend some time trying to figure out how to label those points on the x-axis. But once you have them, you just find your starting point for cosine at the top, for sine in the middle, and you just start going up and down. And that's really all these graphs are going to boil down to. Okay, obviously I'm going to make them quite a bit trickier than that. But at their most basic, that's what's happening. They're just going up and down and up and down. All right, so next up, amplitude. Amplitude is defined to be the height of the sine or cosine wave. So here, my amplitude would be this value right here. And importantly, amplitude is always positive. Okay, so we'll get to that in a second. So in terms of the equations, what you're going to see is that the amplitude puts a number in front of either the sine or the cosine curve, multiplying it. Hey, guess what? That's a vertical stretch again, just like we've had with so many of our graphs. So all it's going to do is change my y values. Amplitude is super awesome. So remember on the graphs we just looked at a minute ago, we had 1 and -1, and that's what we bounced up and down between. Well, with a 3 in front, the only change is what it does to the y-axis. So honestly, when I go to make these graphs, to label my y-axis, all I do is figure out what this number is. And since it's 3, I just put a 3 at the top and a -3 at the bottom. If it were 5, I'd put 5 at the top and -5 at the bottom. If it were -6, please note, amplitude is always positive. But if it were -6, here's what do you think would happen? Well, I'll tell you because you're watching my video. If it were -6, we would still have 6 and -6. But then instead of my cosine curve starting up at the top, that negative would just flip it over. And so instead of starting up here, it would start down there. And maybe we'll see one of those examples here in a couple of minutes. Okay, so the next aspect of these graphs that we have to kind of master is the concept of the period of the function. So remember, we talked about period once before, and the period is when the function starts to repeat itself. For sine and cosine, your basic sine and cosine function will repeat itself every 2 pi. Now, when we are looking at graphs, or really any time, but the period will change if we put a number in and multiply by x. So you'll see here the bx's on the inside. That's going to be a horizontal stretch or compression, and here's how we're going to deal with it. First, we have to be able to figure out the period. So to figure out the period, we always take that b, and we just divide 2 pi by b. Then we're going to count the x-axis. So remember, we're going to label all those x values so that we have our points where we can plot our dots at. And here's how that works. You're going to count along the x-axis by the period divided by 4. So I have an example. Let's look at y equal to the sine of 4x. Okay, and I'll continue this one on the next board because I'm about to run. I obviously ran out of room. Let's look at the y equals sine of 4x. My period here is 2 pi divided by that 4. If you do that, 2 over 4 reduces down to a half, so we get pi over 2. That is my period. That means this graph will start repeating itself when you get to pi over 2. And it'll do the same thing over again. So in terms of labeling the x-axis, I want to take my period, the pi over 2, and divide it by 4. Now be really careful here. Okay, we're doing division with fractions, and this gets messed up a lot, so be very careful. Dividing by 4, remember, is the same as multiplying by 1/4, right? Dividing is the same as multiplying by a reciprocal. If you multiply straight across, you get pi over 8. And that's how we're going to count out our x-axis. And I'm going to erase my board here, and then we'll look at how that graph actually works. Okay, so I've got us all set up here. Obviously, I haven't quite made the graph just yet, but I'm going to for you. So here I have information that we had on the last board. We have our equation, y is equal to the sine of 4x. My period is pi over 2. We're counting by, remember we took the period, we divided by 4, and we got pi over 8. Now, the first thing I'm going to notice with this particular function that I didn't mention before, we do have an amplitude. It is 1. Okay, we don't have anything else in front multiplying, so that's why on my y-axis I have 1 and -1. Right? Again, if this were something like 5, I'd have 5 and -5. All right. Now, along the x-axis, here's what I'm talking about when I say count out by, we're taking that period, dividing by 4, and this is what we're going to count by. So I am counting essentially by eighths, right? 1/8, 2/8, 3/8. Weird bit of weirdness, we have a pi on the top instead of just a number. So here we go. Pi over 8, 2 pi over 8, 3, all the way out to 8. I need 9 total points. And you're like, you only did 8. I need 9, but the first one, remember, is going to be here at the y-axis. So once I get that first one, I just count 8 more. And this will give me 2 full periods for my function. All right, so we know sine starts in the middle at 0. And here's the beauty. Once you have that x-axis labeled, once you have the y-axis labeled, up and down, up and down. So we go up to the top for my next point, back to the middle, down to the bottom. And of course, this is going to get a little bit messy because of all my labels, but it will work, I promise. So I started in the middle, I went to the top, to the middle, to the bottom, to the middle, to the top, right, up and down, up and down. And then I make a nice smooth curve. Let's try not to get V-shapes here. And these should be nice smooth curves. They should not be V-shapes. And there is my sine graph. That's it. It is done. Okay, there are still a couple more things that we can add into these. Remember, if we had a negative in front here, instead of going up first, it would go down. If it were cosine, it would have started at the top instead of at the middle. So those are all the things those are the things you have to think of. But right here, this counting This is going to help you get all those labels on the x-axis that you need, which, by the way, I want to see those, so please don't leave them off.